The storm had come from nowhere, swallowing the desert mountains in a fury of snow and ice that seemed impossible for New Mexico in late November of 1878. And when Colton James pushed open the heavy door of his trapping cabin 3 miles north of Stein's Pass, he found something he never expected to see huddled in the corner near his cold hearth. A woman. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clattered together like rocks tumbling down a hillside, her lips blue as twilight, her fingers curled into useless claws beneath the tattered remains of what had once been a fine traveling dress. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face gone pale as death, and for a moment Colton thought she might already be a corpse until her eyes fluttered open and locked onto his with desperate, fading hope. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible over the howling wind that followed him inside. Colton slammed the door shut and dropped the bundle of firewood he had been carrying, his mind already racing through everything he needed to do to save this woman's life. He had seen frostbite before, had watched men lose fingers and toes, and sometimes their lives to the merciless cold of these high desert mountains when winter storms swept down from the peaks. The cabin was freezing, the hearth long cold since he had been out checking his trap lines for the past 2 days, and this woman looked like she had been fighting death for even longer than that. "How long have you been here?" he asked, already moving to the hearth to start a fire. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and striking his flint with steady strikes that sent sparks cascading into the dry grass he used for tinder. "I don't know," she managed through chattering teeth. "Days, maybe 3. The door was unlocked." Thank God for small mercies, Colton thought. If she had found the cabin locked, she would be dead and frozen somewhere in the snow outside. The kindling caught, and he began feeding larger pieces of wood into the growing flames, building the fire hot and fast. Heat was the first priority, but he had to be careful. Warming someone too quickly after severe cold exposure could kill them just as surely as the cold itself. "What's your name?" he asked, standing and moving to where she huddled against the wall. Up close, she looked even worse. Her dress was torn in several places. Her shoes were little more than scraps of leather barely clinging to her feet, and her exposed skin showed the telltale white patches of frostbite on her fingers and toes. "Delilah," she said. "Delilah Grant. I'm Colton James. This is my cabin." He knelt beside her, his large frame dwarfing her small, shivering form. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes and into something warm. Can you stand?" She tried, pushing against the wall with her damaged hands, but her legs gave out immediately, and she would have collapsed if Colton had not caught her. She weighed almost nothing, he realized, likely having gone days without food. He lifted her easily, his muscled arms cradling her against his chest as he carried her to the bed in the corner of the single-room cabin. The bed was cold but dry, covered in thick furs and wool blankets that he had accumulated over his years of trapping in these mountains. He set Delilah down gently and began pulling the blankets around her, but she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "I can't feel my feet," she said, and there was real fear in her voice now. "Or my hands. I can't feel them at all." "I know," Colton said, his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "I am going to take care of you, but you need to trust me. I have to get these wet clothes off you and warm you up slowly. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something in her gaze that struck him deeply. A fierce will to survive that had kept her alive through days of cold and starvation when most people would have simply given up and died. He found himself wanting to know her story, wanting to understand what had brought a woman in a fancy dress to a trapping cabin in the middle of nowhere, but that would have to wait. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Colton worked quickly but carefully, peeling away the wet, frozen fabric of her dress. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible, respecting her modesty even in these desperate circumstances, and wrapped her in dry wool blankets and furs as soon as he had removed the worst of the wet clothing. Her undergarments were damp but not soaked, and he left those in place, figuring they would dry quickly enough once she was properly bundled. The fire was roaring now, filling the cabin with blessed heat, and Colton moved to his small pantry to gather supplies. He had dried meat, beans, coffee, and flour, along with some root vegetables he had traded for in Stein's Pass on his last trip down the mountain 2 weeks ago. He needed to get food into her, but carefully. Too much too fast after starvation could be dangerous. He filled his battered kettle with water from the barrel by the door and hung it over the fire to heat, then began preparing a simple broth using some of the dried meat and vegetables. While the water heated, he returned to Delilah's side to examine her hands and feet. The frostbite was severe but not catastrophic. Her fingers and toes were white and hard to the touch, completely numb, but he did not see the black discoloration that would indicate tissue death. If he was careful, if he warmed her slowly and treated the damaged areas properly, she might keep all her digits. Might. "This is going to hurt," he warned her. "When the feeling comes back, it is going to hurt worse than almost anything you have ever felt, but you need to bear it. Do not try to warm your hands or feet too quickly, and do not let me rub them no matter how much it seems like that would help. Understand?" "I understand," Delilah said, though her voice trembled. Colton wrapped her hands and feet in soft cloth, keeping them insulated but not actively warming them yet. The core of her body needed to warm first, and then the heat would gradually spread to her extremities naturally. Forcing it faster could cause the frozen blood vessels to rupture and lead to permanent damage. The water began to steam, and Colton poured some into a tin cup, adding just a little of the broth he was making. It was barely more than hot water with a hint of flavor, but it was warm and it was liquid, and it would help bring her core temperature up from the inside. "Drink this slowly," he instructed, helping her sit up enough to take small sips. Her hands were too damaged to hold the cup herself, so he held it for her, tipping it carefully so she would not choke. She drank gratefully, her eyes closing as the warm liquid slid down her throat. "It is the best thing I have ever tasted," she whispered. "It is just hot water and some meat scraps," Colton said, but he felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words. He could not remember the last time anyone had looked at him with such gratitude, such trust. He lived alone by choice, preferring the company of the mountains and the animals he trapped to the noise and complication of human society. But something about this woman made him want to be the kind of man worthy of that trust in her eyes. Over the next hour, Colton worked tirelessly to stabilize Delilah's condition. He fed her more broth in small amounts, gradually adding more substance to it as her stomach accepted the food. He kept the fire at a steady heat, warm but not blazing, and monitored her temperature by pressing his hand to her forehead and neck. She was still dangerously cold, but the violent shivering had subsided to occasional tremors, which was a good sign. As the warmth began to penetrate deeper into her body, Delilah's eyes grew heavy, and she started to drift toward sleep. Colton knew this was both necessary and dangerous. She needed rest desperately, but he also needed to keep checking on her throughout the night to make sure she did not slip into hypothermia's final, deadly stages. "Stay awake just a little longer," he urged, gently shaking her shoulder. "Tell me what happened. How did you end up lost in these mountains?" Delilah's eyes opened, focusing on him with obvious effort. "I was traveling from Santa Fe to Tucson with my father," she said slowly. "He is a merchant. We hired a guide and 2 guards to take us through the mountains. 3 days ago, there was an attack. Bandits, I think. They came at dawn while we were breaking camp. My father told me to run, and I did. I just ran, and I could hear gunshots behind me, but I could not stop. I got turned around in the rocks, and then the storm came, and I could not find my way back. I just kept walking, trying to stay ahead of the cold, and then I saw this cabin. Your father, Colton said carefully. Did you see what happened to him? Tears welled in Delilah's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. I do not know. I heard him call my name, and then there was a shot, and then nothing. I do not know if he is alive or dead. I do not know if anyone survived. Colton felt a surge of anger toward the bandits who preyed on travelers in these remote areas. The territory was still wild and lawless in many places, and good people died every day because of men who took what they wanted without care for the lives they destroyed. But anger would not help Delilah now, and there was nothing he could do about events 3 days past. The storm has been raging for 2 days solid, he said. No one could have tracked you through that, bandit or otherwise. You are safe here. Once you are stronger, we will figure out what to do next. Thank you, Delilah whispered. Thank you for saving my life. Rest now, Colton said, adjusting the furs around her. I will watch over you. She closed her eyes, and within moments her breathing deepened into sleep. Colton sat beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This woman's life was in his hands now, and he would do whatever it took to keep her alive. The storm continued to rage outside, howling around the cabin like a living thing trying to find a way in. Colton added more wood to the fire and settled into his chair, prepared for a long night of watching and waiting. Every few hours he checked Delilah's temperature, made sure she was still breathing steadily, and added more wood to the fire. The cabin grew warm and close, almost stuffy compared to the usual drafty cold he endured during winter storms, but he kept the fire burning bright because she needed the heat. Sometime near dawn, Delilah cried out in pain, and Colton was instantly at her side. Her hands and feet had begun to regain feeling as the warmth penetrated the frozen tissue, and just as he had warned, the pain was intense. She thrashed weakly against the blankets, tears streaming down her face, and Colton caught her hands gently to keep her from hurting herself. I know it hurts, he said, his voice low and soothing, but this is good. Pain means the tissue is alive, means you are going to keep your fingers and toes. You just have to bear it a while longer. It burns, she gasped. It feels like they are on fire. I know. I am sorry, but there is nothing I can give you for the pain that would not do more harm than good right now. You just have to breathe through it. Focus on my voice. Focus on staying present. You are going to be all right. He stayed beside her through the worst of it, holding her hands carefully and talking to her in a steady stream of words that were less about content and more about providing an anchor point for her to cling to. He told her about the mountains, about his trap lines, about the animals he saw and the weather patterns he had learned to read. He told her about growing up in Missouri and coming west after the war, looking for a place where a man could be alone with his thoughts and not have to explain himself to anyone. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through the cabin's single small window, the worst of Delilah's pain began to subside. Her hands and feet were pink and swollen now, tender to the touch, but clearly alive and healing. Colton examined them carefully in the better light and felt relief wash through him. She was going to keep all her fingers and toes. There would be no permanent damage beyond some scarring and perhaps increased sensitivity to cold in the future. You did well, he told her. The worst is over now. I do not feel like I did well, Delilah said weakly. I feel like I screamed like a child. You did what you needed to do to survive, Colton corrected. That is all anyone can ask. He prepared more food, this time making a proper stew with meat and vegetables and beans, thick and nourishing. Delilah's hands were still too tender to hold a spoon properly, so he fed her himself, patiently waiting between bites while she chewed and swallowed. Color was returning to her face now, the deathly pallor replaced by a healthy flush from the warmth of the fire and the food in her belly. As she ate, Colton found himself studying her face more closely. She was beautiful, he realized, in a way that had nothing to do with the conventional prettiness of the women he occasionally saw in town. Her features were strong and defined, her eyes a deep brown that seemed to hold both sadness and strength in equal measure. Her dark hair, now drying in the warmth of the cabin, fell in natural waves around her face. She looked like a woman who had known hardship but had not let it break her. "How old are you?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. 22, Delilah answered. "You?" 28. Colton ladled more stew into her mouth. "You are young to be traveling these territories." "My mother died 2 years ago," Delilah explained. "My father has been teaching me the merchant business so I can help him. We were going to Tucson to meet with some mining companies about supply contracts. It was supposed to be a simple trip." "Nothing is simple in this country," Colton said. "The land does not forgive mistakes." "I am learning that." She paused, looking at him intently. "What about you? Why does a man choose to live alone in a cabin miles from anywhere?" Colton considered his answer carefully. "After the war, I could not stomach being around people anymore. Too much noise, too many demands, too many memories. Up here it is just me and the mountains. The animals do not judge. The silence does not demand explanations. It suits me. It sounds lonely." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than some alternatives." They fell into silence as he finished feeding her the stew, and then Colton cleaned up the dishes and banked the fire to a lower burn. The storm outside had finally begun to ease, though snow was still falling steadily. It would be at least another day or two before the weather cleared enough for any kind of travel, which meant they were stuck here together, whether they liked it or not. Not that Colton minded particularly. There was something about Delilah's presence that eased the usual restlessness he felt when forced to stay inside during storms. She was quiet without being timid, watchful without being afraid. She seemed content to simply exist in the space beside him without needing to fill every moment with chatter. "You should sleep more," he told her. "Your body needs rest to heal." "What about you?" Delilah asked. "You have been awake all night watching over me." "I am used to staying awake." "I will rest later." But despite his words, exhaustion was pulling at him. He had been out in the cold for 2 days before returning to the cabin, checking trap lines and skinning pelts, and then he had stayed up all night tending to Delilah. His body was demanding rest whether he wanted to give it or not. Delilah seemed to sense this. "Lie down," she said. "The bed is large enough for 2 if you stay on your side and I stay on mine. You saved my life. The least I can do is share the bed so you can get some proper rest." Colton started to protest, but another wave of exhaustion hit him and he realized she was right. He needed to sleep, and the floor was cold and hard and not conducive to actual rest. "All right," he agreed, "but just for a few hours." He lay down on the far edge of the bed, staying carefully on top of the furs while Delilah remained bundled beneath them. The bed was narrow enough that they were only a foot or so apart, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. It felt strange to share a bed with someone after so many years alone, but it also felt oddly right, as if this woman belonged here beside him. Sleep claimed him almost instantly, pulling him down into a deep, dreamless rest. When Colton woke, It was late afternoon and the cabin was warm and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crystalline silence that always followed heavy snowfall in the mountains. He could hear nothing but the gentle crackle of the fire and Delilah's steady breathing beside him. He turned his head to find her watching him, her dark eyes calm and thoughtful. "You snore," she said, and there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Sorry about that," Colton replied, feeling his face heat slightly. "Do not be. It was comforting, actually. Reminded me that I was not alone." They looked at each other for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Colton cleared his throat and sat up, breaking the spell. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Delilah said. "My hands and feet still hurt, but not as badly, and I am hungry again." "That is a very good sign." Colton stood and stretched, feeling his muscles protest after the extended sleep in one position. "I will make more food, and I need to check the trap lines, see if the storm did any damage. Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" "I think so," Delilah said, though there was uncertainty in her voice. "How long will you be gone?" "3 hours at most. The fire should stay lit that long, but if you need to add wood, use the smaller pieces from that pile there. Do not try to stand or walk yet. Your feet need more time to heal before you put weight on them." "I will be careful," she promised. Colton bundled himself in his heavy coat and fur hat, wrapped a scarf around his face against the cold, and headed out into the snow. The world outside was transformed, buried under nearly 2 feet of fresh powder that glittered in the late afternoon sun. The sky was clear now, that brilliant blue that only came after winter storms, and the air was so cold it burned going down his throat. He checked his nearest trap lines quickly, finding 2 rabbits and a fox frozen in the traps. He reset the traps and skinned the animals where they lay, working with the efficient speed of long practice. The pelts would fetch good money when he took them down to Stein's Pass to trade, and the meat would supplement his dwindling supplies. With 2 mouths to feed now instead of 1, he would need to hunt more actively. The thought of Delilah staying with him longer than a few days sent an unexpected jolt through his chest. He told himself it was just concern for her safety, just the natural protective instinct any decent man would feel toward a woman who had nearly died. But he knew it was more than that. Something about her called to him, made him want to know everything about her life and her thoughts and her dreams. He shook his head at his own foolishness. She was a merchant's daughter from Santa Fe, educated and refined, while he was a mountain man who spent his days killing animals for their fur and his nights alone in a one-room cabin. When she was healed enough to travel, she would return to civilization and forget all about the rough trapper who saved her life. That was just how the world worked. When Colton returned to the cabin, he found Delilah sitting up in bed with the blankets wrapped around her shoulders. She had clearly been watching the door, and her face brightened when she saw him. "I was starting to worry," she admitted. "The snow slowed me down," Colton explained, setting down his bundle of pelts and frozen meat. "But I brought dinner." He prepared rabbit stew, seasoning it with wild herbs he had dried during the summer. The cabin filled with the savory aroma of cooking meat, and Delilah's stomach growled audibly, making them both laugh. It was a small moment of shared humor, but it felt significant somehow, as if laughter was something precious that should not be wasted. They ate together as darkness fell outside, and this time Delilah's hands were steady enough to hold her own bowl and spoon, though she moved slowly and carefully. Colton found himself watching the way firelight played across her features, the way she closed her eyes with pleasure at the taste of the food, the way she smiled when she caught him looking. "Tell me about your life before the mountains," Delilah said. "You said you came west after the war." "Were you a soldier?" Colton nodded slowly. Union cavalry. I fought for 4 years, saw more death and suffering than any person should have to witness. When it was over, I just wanted silence and space. I wanted to go somewhere I would not have to hear gunfire or smell blood or watch men die. So I came west. That must have been hard. It was necessary. He paused, then added something he had never told anyone. I lost my whole family during the war. My father and 2 brothers fought beside me. None of them came home. My mother died of grief 6 months after Appomattox. There was nothing left for me in Missouri but ghosts and memories. Delilah reached across the small space between them and touched his hand gently. I am sorry. No one should have to bear that alone. Her touch sent warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. What about you? He asked. What was your life like before this happened? Busy, Delilah said with a small smile. My father's business keeps us constantly moving. We travel between towns, buying and selling goods, negotiating contracts. It is exciting but exhausting. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to stay in one place long enough to really know it, to understand its rhythms and seasons. Sounds like you are describing my life, Colton observed. Maybe that is why I like it here, Delilah said softly. Despite everything that happened, despite the fear and the cold and the pain, there is something peaceful about this place. Something real. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and thoughts with an ease that surprised them both. Colton learned that Delilah loved reading but rarely had time for it, that she could speak passable Spanish and some Apache, that she missed her mother every single day. Delilah learned that Colton had once wanted to be a teacher before the war, that he played the harmonica though he had not touched one in years, that he knew the mountains so well he could navigate them in complete darkness. When they finally settled down to sleep, sharing the bed again out of simple practicality, Colton felt something shifting in his chest. This woman had entered his life by pure chance, nearly dead from cold and exposure, and in just 2 days she had somehow become essential to him. He knew he was in danger of falling for her, knew it would only lead to heartache when she inevitably left, but he could not seem to stop himself. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Colton decided it was time to assess what could be done about Delilah's situation. The snow had stopped, but the temperatures were brutal, and there was no way she could travel in her current condition even if the weather cooperated. Her hands and feet were healing but still tender, and she had no proper winter clothing. We need to get word to Stein's Pass, he told her over breakfast. They need to know you are alive, and we need to find out if anyone else from your group survived. But the trip down the mountain is a full day in good weather, longer in snow like this. I do not want to leave you alone that long. I will be fine, Delilah insisted. You have taught me how to tend the fire and where everything is stored. I can manage one day alone. Colton was not convinced, but he also knew she was right that they needed to contact civilization. He spent the rest of the morning preparing for the journey, packing supplies and making sure Delilah had everything she might need. He showed her where he kept his rifle and how to load it, just in case, though he doubted anyone would venture this far up the mountain in winter. I will leave at first light tomorrow, he decided. That gives you another day to heal, and it gives me time to make sure you are truly ready to be alone. You worry too much, Delilah said, but her smile softened the words. I worry just enough, Colton countered. That afternoon, he helped Delilah take her first tentative steps around the cabin. Her feet were still sore, and she leaned heavily on his arm for support, but she could walk short distances without too much pain. Each step represented progress, and Colton found himself ridiculously proud of her determination. You are stronger than you look, he told her as he helped her back to the bed. I have had to be, Delilah replied. Women do not survive in this territory by being delicate flowers. Fair point. That evening, as they shared another meal by firelight, Delilah asked the question Colton had been dreading. What happens after you go to Stein's Pass? What happens to me? Colton set down his bowl carefully. That depends on what we learn. If your father survived, then I imagine he has been searching for you. If he is in Stein's Pass, we will get you reunited. If not, then we figure out how to get you back to Santa Fe safely. And if he did not survive, her voice was small, frightened. Then we deal with that when we know for certain, Colton said firmly. But either way, you are not alone. I will make sure you are taken care of. You have my word on that. Delilah looked at him with those deep brown eyes, and he saw trust there that humbled him. Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know me. You had no obligation to help me. Because it is the right thing to do, Colton said simply. And because I could not live with myself if I did anything less. But even as he said it, he knew there was more to it than simple morality. He cared about this woman, cared about what happened to her in a way that went beyond basic human decency. The thought of her walking out of his life filled him with an ache he had not felt in years, not since before the war when the world still held possibilities and hope. They went to sleep that night lying side by side in the narrow bed, closer than they had been before. Sometime in the night, Colton woke to find Delilah pressed against him, her head on his chest, her arm draped across his stomach. She must have rolled toward him in her sleep, seeking warmth and comfort. He knew he should move away, should maintain proper distance, but he could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he carefully wrapped his arm around her shoulders and let himself enjoy this moment of simple human connection, knowing it might be the only one he ever got. Morning came too quickly. Colton extracted himself carefully from Delilah's embrace and began preparing for his journey down the mountain. He packed light, just enough supplies for the round trip, and double-checked that everything Delilah might need was within easy reach. Be careful, she told him as he prepared to leave. There was worry in her eyes that made his heart clench. Always, Em, he assured her. Keep the fire going, keep the rifle close. Do not open the door for anyone but me. I will be back by tomorrow evening at the latest. I will be here waiting. Colton wanted to say something more, wanted to tell her how much these few days with her had meant to him, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded and headed out into the cold morning air. The journey down the mountain was grueling. The fresh snow made every step an effort, and Colton had to break trail through drifts that sometimes reached his knees. But he pushed on steadily, driven by the need to get information and return to Delilah as quickly as possible. He told himself it was just concern for her safety, but he knew it was more than that. He missed her already, missed the sound of her voice and the warmth of her presence. Stein's Pass was a small settlement that served primarily as a way station for travelers, and a supply point for the mines scattered through the surrounding mountains. It consisted of a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and maybe 24 other buildings clustered along the Southern Pacific Railroad line. When Colton arrived in late afternoon, he went straight to the general store where the owner, a gregarious man named Samuel Martinez, served as the unofficial information hub for the area. Colton James, Samuel exclaimed when he walked through the door. Did not expect to see you until spring. That storm was something fierce. It was, Colton agreed. Samuel, I need information. Was there an attack on a merchant caravan about 5 days ago? Group traveling from Santa Fe to Tucson? Samuel's expression turned grave. There was. How did you hear about it? I found the merchant's daughter at my cabin. She has been lost in the mountains since the attack. Is her father alive? He is, Samuel said, and Colton felt relief wash through him. Daniel Grant. He is staying at the hotel, been organizing search parties though the storm made it impossible to send anyone out. He is half crazy with worry about his daughter, says her name is Delilah. That is her. She is alive and safe, recovering from frostbite, but she will be fine. Praise the Lord, Samuel breathed. You need to go tell him right now. He is in room 3 at the hotel. Colton found Daniel Grant sitting in the small hotel room with his head in his hands, looking like a man who had aged a decade in less than a week. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a lined face, wearing bandages on his left arm and a haunted expression in his eyes. When Colton knocked and introduced himself, Daniel grabbed him by the shoulders with desperate strength. You have news of Delilah. Please tell me you have news. She is alive, Colton said quickly. She found her way to my cabin during the storm. I have been taking care of her. She has frostbite on her hands and feet, but she is going to be fine. She is safe and warm and healing. Daniel Grant sat down heavily on the bed and put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs of relief. Thank God, thank God. I thought I had lost her. When those bandits attacked and she ran, I tried to follow, but they shot me, and by the time I came to, she was gone and the storm was coming in. I have been searching, sending out anyone who would go, but the snow was too deep, and I thought she must be dead. She is tougher than she looks, Colton said. She survived 3 days in those mountains with nothing but a torn dress and determination. That takes real strength. She gets that from her mother, Daniel said, wiping his eyes. Where is she now? How do I get to her? My cabin is 3 miles up the mountain to the north, following Fisher Creek Canyon. But the way is treacherous right now with the snow, and it will be dark soon. We should leave at first light tomorrow. I will guide you there. Daniel wanted to leave immediately, but Colton convinced him that trying to navigate the mountain trails in darkness with fresh snow would be suicidal. Instead, they spent the evening preparing for the journey. Daniel purchased supplies including proper winter clothing for Delilah, blankets, food, and medicine. He wanted to hire horses, but Colton explained that the terrain was too rough and steep for horses with this much snow. They would have to go on foot. That night, Colton barely slept in the hotel room Samuel had insisted on providing free of charge. His mind was back at the cabin with Delilah, hoping she was all right, hoping she had not tried to put too much weight on her healing feet or let the fire burn too low. He found himself counting the hours until he could see her again, and the intensity of that desire frightened him. He was falling in love with her. There was no point denying it anymore. In just a few days, this woman had worked her way into his heart in a way no one else ever had. But she belonged to the civilized world, to merchant negotiations and book learning and society. What could he possibly offer her except a lonely cabin in the mountains and a life of isolation? Dawn came and Colton and Daniel set out up the mountain. Daniel moving slower than Colton would have liked, but keeping pace reasonably well despite his injury. As they climbed, Daniel talked about Delilah, telling stories about her childhood and her mother and the business they had built together. She is all I have left, Daniel said at one point. After her mother died, Delilah became my partner, my friend, my reason for getting up in the morning. I do not know what I would have done if I had lost her too. You did not lose her, Colton reminded him. She is safe. Thanks to you, Daniel said, looking at Colton with gratitude and something else, something more assessing. Samuel told me you are a recluse, that you come to town maybe twice a year and never stay more than a few hours. Yet you saved my daughter and cared for her. That says something about your character. Colton did not know how to respond to that, so he just kept walking. They reached the cabin in late afternoon, and Colton felt his heart lift at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney. She had kept the fire going. Everything was all right. He pushed open the door and found Delilah sitting by the hearth, wrapped in blankets, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "You came back," she said, and then she saw her father behind him, and her expression transformed into pure joy. "Papa!" Daniel rushed to her side and gathered her into his arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Colton stepped back to give them privacy, feeling his chest tighten at the sight of their reunion. This was what he had wanted, what he had worked for. Delilah was safe and back with her father. His job was done. So why did he feel like his heart was breaking? Delilah and Daniel talked for hours, sharing their stories of the attack and the aftermath, crying over the guards and guide who had not survived, planning what they would do next. Colton busied himself preparing food and organizing supplies, staying out of the way, trying to ignore the growing ache in his chest. As evening approached, Daniel stood and addressed Colton formally. "Mr. James, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my daughter's life. If there is anything you need, anything at all, you have only to ask." "No debt," Colton said gruffly. "Anyone would have done the same." "That is not true, and you know it," Daniel countered. "Many men would have taken advantage of a young woman alone and vulnerable. You treated her with honor and respect. You asked for nothing in return. That is rare in this world, and it deserves recognition." "Papa," Delilah spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "We cannot travel back to Stein's Pass tonight. My feet are still too tender for a 3-mile hike." "Can we stay here one more night?" Daniel looked at Colton questioningly, and Colton nodded. "Of course. You take the bed, I will sleep on the floor." "Absolutely not," Daniel said. "You have already given up your bed for days. I will take the floor." "You and Delilah can share the bed as you have been." Colton started to protest, but Daniel held up a hand. "Delilah told me how you cared for her, how you stayed by her side and helped her through the worst of the pain. I trust you completely, Mr. James. Besides, my back has endured worse than a cabin floor." So it was settled. They ate dinner together, the three of them, and the cabin felt both fuller and emptier than it had with just him and Delilah. Fuller because of the sound of conversation and shared stories. Emptier because Colton knew this was the last night he would have with her. When they finally settled down to sleep, Delilah whispered to him in the darkness, "Are you all right? You have been quiet all evening." "Just tired," Colton lied. "It was a long day." "Will you come visit us in Stein's Pass?" she asked. "Before you disappear back into your mountains for the winter, maybe," Colton said, though he doubted he would. It would be easier to make a clean break, to let her fade into memory rather than torture himself with reminders of what he could not have. "I want you to," Delilah said softly. "These days with you have meant more to me than I can say. I do not want this to be goodbye forever." Colton did not trust himself to respond, so he just reached over and squeezed her hand gently. They lay there in silence, not quite touching but connected nonetheless, while Daniel snored softly from his bedroll on the floor. Morning came too quickly. Daniel was eager to get Delilah down to Stein's Pass where a doctor could examine her properly, and Colton could not argue with that logic. He helped gather the supplies Daniel had brought, including a heavy wool coat and sturdy boots for Delilah to replace her ruined traveling clothes. As they prepared to leave, Delilah pulled Colton aside. "Thank you," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for showing me what true kindness looks like." "You do not need to thank me," Colton said roughly. "I am just glad you are safe." "Will I see you again?" Colton wanted to say yes, wanted to promise her that this was not the end, but he could not force the words past the lump in his throat. Instead, he just cupped her face gently with one large hand and said, "Take care of yourself, Delilah Grant." Then he stepped back and watched as she and her father walked away down the snowy trail, Delilah leaning on Daniel's arm for support, moving slowly but steadily. She turned back once to wave, and Colton raised his hand in return, watching until they disappeared around the bend in the trail. The cabin felt unbearably empty after they left. Colton tried to return to his normal routine, checking trap lines and processing pelts, but everything felt hollow now. He caught himself listening for Delilah's voice, turning to share some observation only to remember she was not there. At night, the bed felt too large and too cold, despite the thick furs and blankets. He told himself he would get over it. He had chosen this solitary life, and he had been content with it for years. One woman, known for less than a week, should not have the power to upend his entire world. But as days turned into a week and the week dragged toward two, Colton had to admit the truth. He was in love with Delilah Grant, and sending her away had been the biggest mistake of his life. The problem was, he had no idea what to do about it. She was a merchant's daughter, educated and refined, while he was a rough mountain man who barely remembered how to function in civilized society. What could he possibly offer her? A life of isolation and hardship. A cabin with no books, no music, no connection to the world she knew. Colton was wrestling with these thoughts 2 weeks after Delilah's departure when he heard someone approaching the cabin. He grabbed his rifle instinctively, then relaxed when he recognized Samuel Martinez's voice calling out a greeting. "Colton, you up here? I have something for you." Colton opened the door to find Samuel trudging through the snow, leading a mule laden with supplies. "What are you doing all the way up here, Samuel? You know I do not need resupply until spring." "This is not from me," Samuel said with a grin. "This is from Daniel Grant. He insisted I bring it up personally and make sure you accepted it. Says it is partial payment for saving his daughter's life." "I told him no payment was necessary," Colton said, but he helped Samuel unload the mule anyway. There was flour and sugar and coffee, dried beans and rice and salt pork, a new wool coat and 2 blankets, ammunition for his rifle and a bottle of good whiskey. "There is more," Samuel said, pulling an envelope from his coat. "A letter from Miss Delilah." Colton took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. He did not open it while Samuel was there, instead offering the man coffee and a warm seat by the fire before he headed back down the mountain. They talked about town gossip and the weather forecast, and the price of furs this season, but Colton's attention kept drifting to the letter sitting on the table. After Samuel left, Colton sat down and opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat, elegant handwriting. "Dear Colton, I hope this letter finds you well and that the winter has been kind to you so far. I wanted to write and let you know that my hands and feet have healed completely, with no permanent damage, thanks to your excellent care." The doctor in Stein's Pass was amazed when I told him the story of my survival. "Papa and I remained in Stein's Pass for 2 weeks while I recovered fully, and we have now traveled on to Tucson to complete the business that brought us to this territory in the first place. We will be here for at least 2 months, possibly longer, before returning to Santa Fe. I find myself thinking about you and your cabin often. I wonder if you have caught many animals in your traps, if the winter storms have been severe, if you are lonely in all that silence and solitude. I remember our conversations by the fire and the way you made me feel safe, even when I was in the most danger I have ever faced. Colton, I know this may be forward of me, but I find I must speak plainly. The days I spent in your cabin were the most real and meaningful of my life. You showed me a kind of existence I never knew was possible, one built on self-reliance and connection to the land and honest labor. You showed me what it means to truly be present in each moment, rather than always rushing toward the next thing. I am not asking you to change your life or abandon your mountains, but I would very much like to see you again if you are willing. We will be staying at the Tucson House Hotel on Congress Street. If you find yourself able to make the journey, I would welcome your visit. With deep gratitude and affection, Delilah Grant Colton read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding harder with each reading. She wanted to see him. She had been thinking about him the same way he had been thinking about her. This was not just gratitude or obligation. This was something real, something that might actually have a chance. But could he do it? Could he ride into Tucson, a real city with thousands of people and noise and chaos, after years of living alone in the mountains? Could he face the possibility that whatever connection he felt with Delilah might not survive exposure to the real world? He spent 3 days wrestling with the decision, 3 days of arguing with himself and pacing the cabin and lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke with absolute clarity. He had survived a war that killed most of his friends and all of his family. He had built a life alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. He had faced down bears and mountain lions and winter storms that could kill a man in hours. Surely he could find the courage to ride to Tucson and tell a woman how he felt about her. Colton spent the next day preparing for the journey. He processed all the pelts he had accumulated, bundled them for transport, and packed supplies for the week-long ride to Tucson. He banked the fire in the hearth and secured the cabin against weather and animals, then saddled his horse for the first time in months. The animal was fractious from lack of use, but Colton had always been good with horses, and he soon had the gelding settled and ready to travel. The ride to Tucson took 6 days, following the stage route through the mountains and down into the desert valley, where the city sprawled beneath its crown of surrounding peaks. Colton had been to Tucson once before, years ago, and he had not enjoyed the experience. The noise and crowds and constant motion had set his teeth on edge. But this time was different. This time he had a purpose. He found the Tucson House Hotel easily enough, a 2-story adobe building on Congress Street in the heart of the city. It was late afternoon when he arrived, dusty and travel-worn, leading his horse and his pack mule loaded with furs. He must have looked like exactly what he was, a rough mountain man who had no business in a fine establishment like this. But he walked through the front door anyway, his hat in his hands, and approached the clerk at the desk. "I am looking for Daniel Grant and his daughter Delilah," he said. "They are staying here." The clerk looked him up and down with barely concealed distaste. "And who shall I say is calling?" "Colton James." The clerk's expression changed immediately. "Mr. James, of course. Miss Grant left explicit instructions that if you arrived, we were to inform her immediately. One moment, please." The clerk disappeared up the stairs and returned a few minutes later with Delilah herself, and Colton's breath caught at the sight of her. She was wearing a proper dress of dark green that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair pinned up in an elaborate style that somehow made her look both more sophisticated and more beautiful than he remembered. But when she saw him, her face broke into a smile of such genuine joy that all his nervousness evaporated. "Colton," she said, hurrying down the stairs, "you came. I was not sure you would." "I got your letter," he said simply. "I had to see you. I am so glad." She turned to the clerk. "Please have someone take care of Mr. James's horses and luggage. He will be staying here as our guest." "Miss Grant, I do not think that is appropriate," the clerk began, but Delilah fixed him with a look that could have frozen water. "My father and I owe Mr. James our lives," she said firmly. Whatever he needs, he receives, and the bill goes to our account. Is that clear?" "Yes, Miss Grant, perfectly clear." Delilah took Colton's arm and led him through the hotel lobby and out onto a small courtyard garden where they could talk privately. Now that they were alone, some of Colton's nervousness returned. He was acutely aware of how out of place he looked, his buckskins and beard and long hair marking him as frontier riffraff in this civilized setting. "I do not belong here," he said abruptly. "I should not have come." "You belong wherever you choose to be," Delilah countered. "And I am very happy you chose to be here." She paused, studying his face. "Did you come just because I asked, or did you come because you wanted to see me too?" Colton took a deep breath. He had never been good with words, had never been able to express the things he felt in his heart. But Delilah deserved honesty, deserved to know the truth. "I have not stopped thinking about you since you left," he admitted. "Every day, every night, you are in my head. The cabin feels empty without you. The silence feels wrong. I told myself it was foolish, that we barely know each other, that we come from different worlds. But I cannot lie to myself anymore. I came because I am in love with you, Delilah Grant, and I had to tell you even if it means making a fool of myself." Delilah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You are not making a fool of yourself," she said softly. "I feel the same way. I have been in love with you since that first night when you stayed awake watching over me, making sure I did not die. Maybe even before that, when I opened my eyes and saw you standing there and knew I was finally safe. But I am a trapper," Colton protested. "I live in a one-room cabin miles from anywhere. I have nothing to offer you but a hard life in isolation." "You have yourself to offer," Delilah said. "And that is everything I want." She took both his hands in hers. "Colton, I have lived my whole life moving from place to place, never putting down roots, always focused on the next deal and the next town. I am tired of that life. I want something real, something lasting. I want a home, not just another hotel room, and I want to build that home with you if you will have me." "Your father will never approve," Colton said, but hope was kindling in his chest despite his doubts. "Let me worry about my father," Delilah said. "In fact, let us go talk to him right now. He is in his room working on correspondence." Daniel Grant's reaction to seeing Colton was warm but cautious. He shook hands and offered thanks for the mountain man's hospitality once again, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as he looked between his daughter and Colton. "Papa," Delilah said, taking Colton's hand, "Colton and I have something to tell you. We are in love and we want to be together." Daniel sat down heavily in the room's single chair. "I see," he said slowly. "And what exactly does being together mean? Marriage, living in sin?" "What are we discussing here? Marriage," Colton said firmly. "I want to marry your daughter, Mr. Grant, if you will give us your blessing. I know I am not the kind of man you probably imagined for her. I have no education, no wealth, no position in society. But I love her with everything I am, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure she is happy and safe and cherished." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Delilah. "Is this truly what you want? A life in the wilderness with a man you have known for less than a month?" "It is what I want more than anything," Delilah said without hesitation. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." "Then you have my blessing," Daniel said, and both Delilah and Colton sagged with relief. "But," Daniel continued, holding up a finger, "I have conditions. First, you will have a proper wedding here in Tucson before you disappear into the mountains. I want my daughter married legally and properly, with witnesses and a ceremony. Second, you will promise to bring her into town at least once every few months so I can see her and know she is well. I may approve of this marriage, but I am still her father and I will not lose contact with her completely." "Those are more than fair conditions," Colton agreed. "Thank you, sir." Daniel stood and embraced his daughter, then shook Colton's hand again. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "She is all I have left of my wife. If anything happens to her because of this choice, I will hold you personally responsible." "I understand," Colton said, "and I give you my word." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Delilah and Daniel handled the arrangements for the wedding while Colton sold his furs and purchased supplies for the cabin. He bought items he had never bothered with before, things he thought Delilah might appreciate, including books, a proper set of dishes, fabric for curtains, and seeds for a summer garden. He also bought lumber and tools, planning to expand the cabin before winter set in again. One room was sufficient for a bachelor, but if he was bringing home a wife, he wanted to build her something better. Maybe 2 rooms, maybe even 3. A proper bed instead of the narrow cot he currently used, glass windows instead of shuttered openings, a larger hearth with a proper oven for baking. His mind buzzed with plans and possibilities, and he found himself smiling at odd moments, unable to quite believe his good fortune. The wedding took place on a warm afternoon in early February, in a small church near the hotel. Daniel had invited several of his business associates, and a few of the townspeople Colton had met while preparing for the wedding attended as well. Colton wore new clothes for the occasion, dark trousers and a white shirt and a vest, though he had refused to cut his hair or shave his beard beyond trimming them neatly. This was who he was, and Delilah had fallen in love with the mountain man, not some cleaned-up version of him. When Delilah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Colton forgot how to breathe. She wore a simple white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair loose around her shoulders the way he liked it, and she looked at him with such love in her eyes that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The ceremony itself passed in a haze. Colton repeated his vows in a voice that only shook slightly, slipped a simple gold band onto Delilah's finger, and kissed her when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. The small congregation applauded, and then they were married, bound together for the rest of their lives. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. There was cake and champagne, music and dancing, and Colton found himself actually enjoying the social interaction, despite his usual discomfort with crowds. It helped that Delilah never left his side, her hand always in his, her presence grounding him. As evening approached, Daniel pulled them both aside. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, handing Colton an envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $500, more money than Colton had ever seen in one place. "Sir, I cannot accept this," Colton protested. "Yes, you can," Daniel said firmly. "Consider it an investment in my daughter's future comfort. Use it to improve your cabin, to buy supplies, to make sure she has what she needs. And remember, you promised to bring her to visit regularly. I intend to hold you to that." "We will visit," Delilah assured him, hugging her father tightly. "I promise." That night, Colton and Delilah stayed in the finest room the Tucson House Hotel had to offer, a suite with a real bed and a private bathing room and windows that overlooked the city. They made love for the first time as husband and wife, slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies with hands and lips and whispered words of love. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Delilah curled against his side, Colton felt a peace he had not known since before the war. This was what he had been missing all those years alone in the mountains, not just physical companionship but emotional connection. Someone to share his thoughts with, someone to build a future beside. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we leave Tucson, once we return to the cabin, there is no going back. It is a hard life up there, especially in winter. I do not want you to have regrets." "My only regret would be not being with you," Delilah said. "I am not afraid of hard work or isolation, Colton. I am afraid of waking up one day and realizing I spent my whole life doing what was expected instead of what I truly wanted. You are what I truly want." "I will do everything in my power to make you happy," Colton promised. "You already do," Delilah replied, "just by being yourself." They left Tucson 3 days later, after Delilah had helped her father complete his business negotiations and said her goodbyes. The journey back to the cabin took longer than Colton's trip to Tucson had, because he was no longer traveling alone. He kept the pace easy for Delilah's sake, camping under the stars at night and teaching her the skills she would need for mountain life. She proved to be a quick learner, picking up how to read tracks and predict weather and identify edible plants. She did not complain about the hard ground or the simple food or the long days in the saddle. Instead, she seemed to drink in every new experience with enthusiasm, asking questions and practicing skills until she had mastered them. When they finally crested the last ridge and the cabin came into view below them in its small clearing beside Fisher Creek, Delilah let out a happy sigh. "Home," she said simply. Colton had worried that the cabin might seem small and crude after the comfortable hotel in Tucson. But Delilah moved through the space with obvious pleasure, examining everything with new eyes. She immediately began planning improvements and rearrangements, talking about where they could put shelves for her books and how they could organize the cooking area more efficiently. "First things first," Colton said, pulling her into his arms. "We need to expand. I am going to build you a proper home with separate rooms and real windows and all the comforts I can manage." "I do not need comforts," Delilah protested. "I just need you." "You are getting both," Colton said firmly. Over the next few months, they fell into a rhythm of work and life together. Colton continued checking his trap lines and processing pelts, but now he had help. Delilah proved surprisingly adept at skinning and stretching hides, and she had clever ideas for using every part of the animals they caught. Nothing was wasted under her management. They also began the cabin expansion. Using the lumber Colton had purchased in Tucson and additional wood they cut from the surrounding forest, they built 2 new rooms onto the original structure. One became a proper bedroom with a real bed frame and a chest for storing clothes. The other became a combined workspace and library, with shelves for Delilah's growing collection of books and a large table where they could work on various projects. Colton installed glass windows that let in sunlight and warmth, and he built a larger hearth with an oven cavity where Delilah could bake bread. He constructed a porch across the front of the cabin where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Delilah transformed the rough bachelor cabin into a real home. She sewed curtains from the fabric Colton had bought, made cushions for the chairs, planted a garden in the clearing that produced vegetables and herbs through the summer and fall. She organized their supplies with meticulous care, ensuring they would have everything they needed through the long winter months. But more than the physical improvements, Delilah brought joy and companionship to Colton's solitary existence. They talked for hours every evening, sharing thoughts and stories and dreams. They made love in their comfortable bed, learning each other's preferences and desires. They worked side by side during the day, moving in the comfortable synchronization of a well-matched team. True to their promise, they made the trip down to Stein's Pass every few months so Delilah could write letters to her father and receive his responses. The first few trips, Daniel traveled to meet them there, wanting to assure himself that his daughter was truly happy with her choice. When he saw the way Delilah glowed with health and contentment, the way she and Colton moved around each other with easy affection, his concerns eased. "You were right," he told his daughter on one of those visits. This life suits you better than the one I had planned for you." "I still love you, Papa," Delilah assured him, "and I am grateful for everything you taught me. But yes, this is where I belong." As seasons turned and years passed, Colton and Delilah's life in the mountains continued to evolve and deepen. The cabin they had built together became truly their own, filled with small touches that reflected both their personalities. Colton's trapping tools and hunting gear shared space with Delilah's books and sewing projects. His practical furniture coexisted with her decorative touches. In the spring of 1880, 2 years after their wedding, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Colton with a terror he had not felt since the war. The cabin was miles from any doctor, and childbirth in the frontier was dangerous even under the best circumstances. But Delilah was calm and confident, reading every medical text she could get her hands on and preparing carefully for the birth. When her time came in late October, she labored for 18 hours while Colton paced and prayed and felt more helpless than he ever had in his life. But Delilah was strong, and when their son finally entered the world with a healthy cry, Colton wept with relief and joy. They named him Colton James, and he had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong build. Colton was terrified of the tiny, fragile creature at first, but Delilah taught him how to hold the baby properly, how to soothe his cries, how to change his diapers and rock him to sleep. Fatherhood changed Colton in ways he had not expected. His son gave him a new reason to work hard and plan for the future, a new connection to the world beyond himself. He found himself wanting to make the mountains safer and more comfortable for Colton, wanting to build something lasting that could be passed down through generations. 2 years later, their daughter Hannah was born, followed 3 years after that by another son they named Matthew. The cabin that had once seemed spacious for two now overflowed with the chaos of family life, but Colton could not imagine wanting it any other way. The children grew up wild and free in the mountains, learning to track animals and identify plants and read the weather signs. Colton inherited his father's size and strength, becoming a skilled hunter and trapper. Hannah was more like her mother, curious and book-smart, always asking questions about how things worked. Matthew was the adventurer, constantly wandering off to explore and giving his parents heart attacks on a regular basis. Daniel Grant visited when he could, making the trip from Santa Fe less frequently as he aged, but always bringing gifts and stories for his grandchildren. He lived long enough to see Colton reach his 15th birthday, dying peacefully in his sleep during a visit to the mountain cabin in the summer of 1895. They buried him in a beautiful spot overlooking the valley, with a headstone Colton carved himself from local granite. Delilah grieved her father's death deeply, but found comfort in knowing he had died happy, surrounded by the family he loved. As the years continued to pass, Colton and Delilah's love only deepened and matured. They weathered hardships together, including harsh winters, illness, and the everyday struggles of frontier life. But they also experienced countless moments of joy, from quiet evenings by the fire to celebrations of their children's milestones to stolen kisses while working in the garden. The mountains that Colton had once used as an escape from human connection became instead a sanctuary where he and Delilah built a life of meaning and purpose. The cabin that had sheltered Delilah when she was lost and dying became the foundation of a legacy that would continue through their children and grandchildren. Colton grew into a man as tall and strong as his father, with the same quiet competence and love of the wilderness. He married a young woman from Stein's Pass named Sarah, and they built their own cabin a few miles from Colton and Delilah's, establishing a small family compound in the mountains. Hannah, true to her studious nature, eventually left the mountains to attend a teacher's college in Santa Fe. But she returned every summer and eventually married a school teacher who appreciated her intelligence and independence. They divided their time between Santa Fe and the mountains, giving Hannah the best of both worlds. Matthew, the adventurer, spent several years exploring the Western Territories before finally settling down with a woman he met in Colorado. They built a ranch in a valley north of the mountains, raising horses and cattle while maintaining close ties with the family. Colton and Delilah became grandparents many times over, their cabin a gathering place for the extended family during holidays and special occasions. The children and grandchildren filled the spaces Colton had built with love and laughter, creating memories that would last long after he was gone. In the fall of 1910, as Colton approached his 60th birthday and Delilah turned 54, they sat together on the porch they had built so many years ago and watched the sun set over the mountains they both loved. "You ever regret it?" Colton asked, taking Delilah's hand in his. "Choosing this life instead of staying in civilization?" "Not for a single moment," Delilah said firmly. "Everything good in my life came from that storm that led me to your cabin. Our marriage, our children, this home we built together, it all started with you saving my life that day." "You saved mine too," Colton said. "I was just surviving before you came along, not really living. You taught me that isolation was not the same thing as peace, that a man needs connection and love to truly be whole." "We saved each other," Delilah concluded, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And we built something beautiful in the process." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting so many years ago. The cabin behind them was warm and inviting, filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Their children were grown and happy, their grandchildren were healthy and thriving, and they had each other still after more than 3 decades of marriage. It was, Colton reflected, more than he had ever dreamed possible when he was a young man fleeing the horrors of war. It was more than Delilah had imagined when she stumbled into a trapping cabin, half frozen and desperate for shelter. But together, they had created something that transcended their individual stories, something that would continue long after they were gone. The mountain man who had found a shivering woman in his cabin all those years ago could never have predicted how completely she would transform his life. But he was grateful every single day for the storm that brought her to him, for the love that grew between them, for the family they created and the home they built. As they grew older, Colton's strength began to wane and his joints ached with the cold. But Delilah was always there to support him, just as he had supported her through her own difficulties over the years. They cared for each other with the same tenderness they had shown that first week in the cabin, when everything was new and uncertain. In 1918, as Colton reached his 68th year, he developed a persistent cough that gradually worsened despite Delilah's best efforts at treatment. The doctor they finally summoned from Stein's Pass confirmed what they both already knew in their hearts. Colton's lungs, damaged by years of smoke from the cabin's hearth and exposure to harsh mountain weather, were failing. The family gathered at the cabin that winter, all 3 children and many of the grandchildren, filling the expanded structure to capacity. They took turns sitting with Colton, sharing memories and expressing their love and gratitude for the life he had given them. On a clear February morning, with Delilah holding his hand and his family surrounding him, Colton James passed away peacefully in the bed he had shared with his wife for 40 years. His last words were, "I love you," spoken to Delilah with the same fervor he had expressed on their wedding day. Delilah grieved deeply, but without bitterness. She had been blessed with 40 years of marriage to the man she loved, had raised 3 wonderful children, and had built a life rich with meaning and purpose. Colton had given her all of that and more. She lived another 12 years after his death, remaining in the cabin they had built together, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She maintained the trap lines Colton had established, kept the garden thriving, and continued to write letters and journals documenting their family history. When Delilah Grant James died peacefully in her sleep in April of 1930, at the age of 74, she was buried beside Colton in the spot overlooking the valley. Their headstones stood side by side, simple granite markers bearing their names and dates and the words, "Together always." The cabin they had built became a treasured family landmark, maintained by their descendants through the generations. Carson's children and grandchildren kept up the trap lines and the traditions, ensuring that the legacy of Colton and Delilah's love would endure. And on quiet winter evenings, when snow fell softly on the mountains and the wind whispered through the pines, some said you could still feel the presence of the mountain man and the woman he saved, the love that had transformed 2 lives into one enduring story of survival, devotion, and the power of human connection in even the most isolated places. Their story became legend in the family, passed down through generations as a reminder of what was possible when 2 people truly committed to each other, and to building a life based on love, respect, and shared purpose. The descendants of Colton and Delilah James carried forward their values of self-reliance, kindness, and appreciation for the natural world. The cabin itself was eventually transformed into a family museum of sorts, preserved as it had been in Colton and Delilah's time, filled with the tools and books and mementos of their life together. Photographs of the couple hung on the walls, showing them at various stages of their life, from the early days when they were young and strong to their final years together, still holding hands and smiling at the camera. One photograph in particular became iconic within the family. It had been taken in 1908, on their 30th wedding anniversary, showing Colton and Delilah standing on the porch they had built together. Colton's hair was completely white by then, his beard full and long, his massive frame still imposing despite his advancing years. Delilah stood beside him, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined but still beautiful, her hand firmly clasped in his. The love between them was visible in every line of their posture, in the way they leaned slightly toward each other, in the expressions on their faces. It was the love of 2 people who had weathered every storm together, who knew each other completely and loved each other anyway, who had built something that would outlast them both. And so the story of the mountain man who found a woman shivering in his trapping cabin, who nursed her back to health and then fell in love with her, who built a life and a family with her in the wild mountains of New Mexico, became a permanent part of the James family legacy. It was a story of chance and choice, of survival and love, of 2 people who found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to spend the rest of their lives together. It was, in the end, a story with the kind of happy ending that only comes from hard work, commitment, and the willingness to take a chance on love even when it seems impossible. And it all started with a storm, a locked cabin door left open by chance, and a mountain man who chose kindness when he could have chosen differently. Their love story became a testament to the idea that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances, that love can bloom in the harshest environments, and that a life built on mutual respect and genuine partnership can weather any storm. The cabin in the mountains stood as a monument to that truth, a reminder that home is not a place but a feeling, And that feeling is created by the people we choose to share our lives with. The descendants of Colton and Delilah, James continued to thrive in the mountains and beyond, carrying forward the legacy of strength, resilience, and love that their ancestors had established. And whenever they gathered at the old cabin, whenever they told the story of how it all began, they remembered that everything good in their lives could be traced back to one cold winter day in 1878, when a mountain man opened his cabin door and found a woman shivering in the corner. And instead of turning away, he chose to help, and in doing so, found the love of his life.